The room did not erupt. It went silent. Sophie had expected a routine family briefing, perhaps another careful conversation about legacy, jewels, and royal memory. Instead, one sentence changed everything. Louise, her daughter, had inherited the Queen Mother's private pearl crown set. Not a symbolic keepsake, not a ceremonial loan, a private royal treasure passed directly into the hands of a young woman no one expected to be named. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Sophie felt the air leave her chest before she found a single word. Louise sat beside her, still and pale, trying to understand why every face in the room had turned toward her, as if she had stepped across an invisible line. The Queen Mother's private pearl crown set a personal collection of pearl jewels, once kept away from regular public use and guarded as family memory rather than simple decoration, had now been placed in Louise's name. That was the sentence. That was the shock. Sophie had walked in expecting routine inheritance records, the kind of careful royal paperwork that decides where old possessions rest. But this was not routine. This was a royal signal, and every person in that room understood it. Charles did not move when the decision was read aloud. The king kept his eyes lowered, his hands calm, his expression fixed in a way that told Sophie he had known exactly what this announcement would do. He had approved it. He had carried the weight of it before anyone else heard the words. Camilla, seated across the room, did not ask for clarification, and that silence struck Sophie harder than any question could have. The queen consort already knew enough. She had heard something before this moment, perhaps only a whisper, perhaps more, but she was not surprised in the way Sophie was surprised. That difference mattered. It meant the room had been prepared for a storm, and Sophie had walked into it without armor. Louise finally looked at her mother, and pride collided with fear in one trembling glance. She was not raised to chase power. She had never pushed herself into the brightest circle of the monarchy. Yet suddenly, a crown set tied to the old heart of royal womanhood had fallen into her hands, carrying memory, expectation, and judgment. Sophie wanted to protect her. She also knew protection would not erase what had just been done. The pearls had chosen a new keeper through royal decision, but the reason was still hidden. And before Sophie could understand why her daughter had been placed at the center of such a powerful inheritance, she had to face the people who would feel its consequences first. Louise had spent years moving gently around the edges of royal life, never demanding a spotlight, never chasing attention, never treating her name as a weapon. That was exactly why this moment felt so dangerous. Sophie saw the shift instantly. The inheritance had not only given Louise a crown set, it had changed how the family looked at her, how the palace measured her, and how history might now claim her. Sophie watched her daughter lower her eyes, and the trusted confidant felt no victory in that moment. Lady Louise Windsor, a younger member of the royal family, known for quiet duty rather than public power, had suddenly been pulled toward the center of a story she never tried to enter. That mattered, because royal life rewards symbols as much as service. And this crown set was now a symbol people would argue over. Sophie knew another truth too. Her own years of loyalty had not gone unnoticed, and some would see Louise's inheritance as a reflection of the mother's quiet service as much as the daughter's character. Louise leaned closer and asked the question Sophie had feared. Would people resent her for accepting it? The words were soft, but they cut through everything. Sophie realized her daughter already understood the danger. The pearl crown set was not just pearls and metal. It was a private royal treasure, meaning it had belonged to family memory rather than public ceremony. And that made it more personal, more emotional, more explosive. Louise was proud, yes, but she was also frightened. She knew the jewels carried silence, judgment, and old loyalties no one in the room wanted to name too quickly. Edward watched Sophie's face with the careful sadness of a man who understood too much. He could see that she was not stunned by beauty, she was stunned by trust. The choice told the family that Louise had been seen, measured, and quietly approved by powers far above her own wishes. Edward understood why that would shake Sophie. A gift like this did not simply honor a young woman. It placed her under a brighter light, and the father knew his daughter had never asked to stand there. Camilla's expression hardened when the Queen Mother was mentioned again. The Queen Consort did not interrupt, but Sophie noticed the stillness around her mouth, the controlled breath, the cold restraint. That name carried more than family history. It carried memory, rank, and the old emotional map of the monarchy. Louise stood beside Sophie as the meeting ended, still holding herself with quiet discipline. But one question followed them out like a shadow. Who had decided that this young woman was worthy of a treasure others expected to remain untouched? The answer was buried not in the announcement itself, but in a forgotten moment that had quietly altered Louise's place inside the royal family forever. Every royal shock has a beginning. This one began far from cameras, far from balcony appearances, far from public celebration. It began at a small private garden ceremony at Windsor, when Louise did something no one had expected. She did not speak loudly. She did not seek attention. But one quiet act that afternoon reached the ears of the most powerful people in the family and changed the future of the Pearl Crown set. Louise had stepped forward when others stayed still. The ceremony was held to honor the Queen Mother's memory, and a ceremony simply means a formal event built around respect, tradition, and symbolic meaning. But this one carried a softer weight, because it gathered people who still remembered the old royal household from the inside. An elderly former attendant stood quietly after the formal words ended, overwhelmed by the mention of pearls she had once helped prepare. Louise noticed her before anyone else did. She walked to her, said her name, and remembered a small story the woman had once shared about the Queen Mother touching the pearls before difficult family occasions. That one act mattered because it showed memory without performance. It showed care without ambition. Sophie watched from a distance, moved and uneasy at the same time. The trusted confidant knew royal observers rarely missed those moments. Loud gestures could be dismissed. Quiet sincerity stayed in people's minds. Louise did not know she was being measured. She only saw an old woman standing alone, with a memory too heavy to carry. Later, when mother and daughter spoke privately, the young royal told Sophie she had only wanted the attendant to feel remembered. Those words stayed with Sophie because they proved Louise had acted without calculation, and in royal life, innocence can sometimes become the most dangerous kind of power. Charles heard about the moment through a documented account prepared after the ceremony by a senior courtier. The king read the note himself, and the note later entered the private inheritance file, which means the family record used to decide where personal royal possessions should go. That detail changed everything. The monarch privately marked the file after learning that Louise had spoken about duty without using the word power. He saw something rare there. Not hunger, not entitlement, not a demand for visibility. He saw someone who understood legacy as service before status. Sophie did not know then that the garden ceremony had become the point of no return. Louise did not know either. But the courtier's note connected her compassion directly to the future of the Queen Mother's private pearl crown set. And once that connection existed, the decision began moving quietly toward her name. Yet that same truth would soon wound others. Because the moment sentiment crossed paths with rank, the confrontation was no longer avoidable. The door closed with a softness that made the room feel even colder. Sophie stood across from Camilla, knowing this was no longer about jewelry. It was about recognition, influence, and the invisible map of royal favor. Camilla did not raise her voice. Sophie did not step back. Between them sat the truth neither woman could ignore. Louise's inheritance had disturbed the balance of the family. Sophie kept her voice calm, but the trusted confidant felt the sting beneath every polite word. Camilla questioned whether Louise was ready to carry something so closely tied to royal matriarchal history, meaning the chain of powerful women whose choices shaped the family before the younger generation arrived. That mattered because the pearl crown set was not a simple ornament. It belonged to the emotional memory of women who had held the monarchy steady through grief, war, scandal, and change. Sophie understood the concern, but she also heard the doubt. The queen consort was not only asking if Louise was prepared, she was asking why Louise had been chosen at all. Camilla held her ground, and the queen consort's restraint made the moment sharper. She felt overlooked, not because she needed another jewel, but because this particular set carried symbolic standing. A legacy object like that could strengthen a royal woman's place in the family story. Instead, it had moved past her and landed with a younger, quieter figure. Sophie saw the wound behind the control. She saw the pride, the disappointment, the fear of being silently judged by a decision no one had explained fully. Still, the trusted confidant refused to let Louise become the target of that pain. Sophie placed her hand on the back of a chair and finally said what had been sitting between them from the start. Louise did not ask for it. The words landed hard. Camilla looked at her, and for a brief second, the queen consort had no answer. That was the truth no one could soften. Louise had not campaigned, pushed, whispered, or positioned herself. The choice had come from above. Someone with authority had moved the crown set toward her, and that meant the confrontation in this room was only touching the surface. Camilla then revealed, through a private recorded conversation later summarized in the family file, that she had believed the pearl crown set would remain sealed indefinitely. Sealed meant kept closed within private royal holdings, away from use, display, or transfer until another decision reopened it. Sophie understood the danger at once. If Camilla believed the set was never meant to move, then someone had changed the plan without bringing her fully inside the decision. The confrontation ended without shouting, but it did not end peacefully. Sophie left with one cold certainty. To understand why Camilla had been bypassed, she needed to look past emotion and into the machinery of royal control. Power inside the monarchy rarely announces itself. It moves through signatures, sealed instructions, quiet approvals, and the silence of people who know more than they say. Sophie discovered that Louise's inheritance had not been impulsive. It had passed through careful hands. Charles had read the file. Edward had been consulted. And somewhere inside the decision was a message about the future of trust within the royal family. Sophie felt the ground shift when Edward finally admitted he had known part of the decision before the wider family heard it. The trusted confidant did not shout. That would have been easier. Instead, she stared at him with the quiet hurt of someone realizing a secret had lived inside her own home. Edward explained that he had not been asked to influence the outcome. He had been informed because the decision carried emotional weight for their daughter, and because Louise would need protection from the shock that followed. That mattered because this was not a normal family gift. The transfer meant a private royal possession was formally moved from one named keeper to another, turning memory into responsibility. Charles had been the central authority. The king had approved the Queen Mother's private pearl crown set moving to Louise, and approval meant the final royal permission that allowed the decision to stand. He had not done it lightly. He had read the inheritance file himself, and that file contained the note from the Windsor Garden ceremony. Sophie now understood why the past kept returning. Louise had not simply inherited pearls. She had inherited the meaning attached to that one quiet act, the moment when kindness reached higher than rank. Edward watched Sophie absorb it, then gave the truth he had been holding back. He stayed silent because he feared she would try to refuse the inheritance on Louise's behalf. The father knew his wife's first instinct would be protection. Sophie would rather carry pain herself than let their daughter become the subject of cold royal debate. But Edward believed refusal would wound Louise in another way. It would teach her that trust was something to fear. So he waited. He protected the secret badly, perhaps, but he protected it out of love. Proken. Sophie later learned more through a documented account from a senior courtier attached to the family record. The courtier told her the pearl crown set had not been given to elevate Louise above others. It had been given to preserve the set with someone who would not exploit it. Those words struck Sophie harder than praise. Charles had seen restraint as strength. Edward had seen silence as protection. Louise had seen only duty. The decision finally had a clear source, but peace did not follow. By the time Sophie understood the power behind the inheritance, the fallout had already begun. The first consequence was not public, it was personal. Louise sat alone with Sophie, staring at the reality of what had been placed before her. She was not smiling. She was not celebrating. She was trying to understand why an object from another royal woman's life had suddenly become part of her own. Sophie saw fear in her daughter's face, and for the first time, the inheritance felt almost cruel. Louise kept her voice low when she finally admitted what frightened her most. People would think she had taken something. Sophie heard the pain beneath that simple fear, and the trusted confidant understood why it mattered. The pearl crown set belonged to a world where jewels were never just jewels. They carried memory, duty, family expectation, and old emotional debts. A crown set meant a matched group of royal jewels, designed to be worn together, and in this case, its power came from the woman who once owned it. Louise had not chased that power. Still, the world might not see the difference. Sophie moved closer and told her daughter that accepting a legacy did not mean apologizing for being chosen. The words sounded strong, but the mother felt shaken inside. She knew how quickly admiration could become resentment inside a family built on rank. She knew how easily a quiet young woman could be turned into a symbol by people who needed someone to blame. Louise listened, but fear stayed in her eyes. She was proud of the trust, yet terrified of what that trust would cost. Sophie saw it clearly now. The inheritance had honored Louise, but it had also placed her at the center of a fight she never wanted. Edward entered with a face that changed the room before he even spoke. He revealed through a private family conversation, later noted in the household record, that certain relatives had already requested a review of the inheritance wording. A review meant a formal second look at the exact language of the decision, usually to test whether anything could be questioned, delayed, or softened. Louise repeated the word almost under her breath. Review. That was when she understood the truth. Even after Charles had approved the transfer, even after the king had allowed the crown set to move into her name, some people were not ready to accept it. Sophie looked from Edward to Louise and felt the pressure closing in. The father wanted calm. The daughter wanted certainty. The mother wanted to protect them both. But protection now had two meanings. Sophie could hide Louise from the storm and risk making her seem weak, or she could let her daughter face the family with dignity and risk exposing her to pain. The choice was no longer about pearls, it was about courage. And that choice would lead to the most important private conversation of the entire crisis. No aides, no courtiers, no royal language, just a mother and daughter sitting together after a day that had changed them both. Sophie looked at Louise and saw the child she had protected, but also the young woman the monarchy had suddenly recognized. The shock had passed. What remained was harder. Louise had to decide whether she would carry the pearl crown set as a burden or as a promise. Sophie reached for honesty before comfort, because comfort alone would not help her daughter survive what was coming. She admitted her first instinct had been to protect Louise by refusing the attention around the crown set. The trusted confidant had wanted to step between her daughter and the storm, to turn the inheritance into something quiet again, before the family could argue over it. That mattered, because this was no longer only about private jewels. It had become a test of whether Louise could be trusted with royal memory without being punished for receiving it. Louise listened, and something inside her steadied. She told Sophie she did not want to run from something given in trust. Trust meant more than approval. It meant someone had believed she would protect what others might use for pride. The young royal understood now that refusing the pearls would not make the pressure disappear. It would only suggest that fear had the final word. Sophie heard the change in her daughter's voice. It was still gentle, still careful, but there was resolve beneath it now. Louise was not reaching for power. She was choosing not to shrink from responsibility. Sophie then revealed the truth she had been carrying from the family record. Through a documented account attached to the inheritance file, the trusted confidant explained the Windsor Garden ceremony, and the elderly former attendant Louise had comforted. She told her daughter that kindness had shaped the decision. Not rank, not ambition, not beauty, character. Louise sat very still as the meaning settled over her. The moment she had forgotten to protect herself had become the moment others remembered her most. Louise finally understood why the Queen Mother's private pearl crown set had moved toward her name. It was not a prize, it was a mirror. It reflected the quiet service she had shown when no one important was supposed to be watching. Sophie saw the fear in her daughter soften into something stronger. Not excitement, not triumph, dignity. The mother still wanted to protect her, but she now understood protection could not mean hiding Louise forever. Sometimes love meant standing beside her and letting her be seen. The choice changed everything. Louise would face the family without apology, and Sophie would not let doubt steal the meaning of what had been entrusted to her child. The private conversation ended with no grand promise, only a silent understanding between them. But outside that room, the story was already moving beyond palace walls. And when the world finally saw what had happened, the quiet inheritance became a national royal shock. By morning, the story had escaped the palace walls. It was no longer a private inheritance. It was a national conversation about legacy, loyalty, and who the monarchy rewards when no one is watching. Louise's name was suddenly everywhere. Sophie saw the headlines before breakfast and froze again, not because the story was false, but because the world had finally understood its emotional power. Sophie read the first front page twice before she let herself breathe. A London newspaper had placed a close image of pearls beside the headline, "The Quiet Heiress," and the words hit the trusted confidant with brutal force. Louise was no longer only her daughter in a private family crisis. She had become a public symbol. The Queen Mother's private pearl crown, set a family treasure, kept away from ordinary public use because it carried personal royal memory, was now being discussed by broadcasters, commentators, and strangers who had never seen the fear in Louise's face. That mattered, because the public did not just see jewels. They saw a message about character, duty, and who the monarchy believed deserved trust. Louise stared at her own name in bold print, and felt exposed in a way she had never wanted. She had faced family pressure, but this was different. Family tension could be contained behind closed doors. Public fascination could not. Sophie watched her daughter go quiet and understood the danger immediately. Praise could feel like judgment when it arrived too loudly. Admiration could become another kind of pressure. Louise had inherited a crown set, but now the world was trying to inherit her meaning. Palace staff moved quickly, preparing a restrained response, meaning a careful official statement designed to calm attention without revealing private family details. But the emotional force of the story made simple words feel too small. One broadcaster described Louise as the young royal trusted with memory, not power, and that framing spread fast. Sophie heard the phrase and felt both relief and fear. Relief because someone understood. Fear because understanding could still become obsession. Louise did not want to be turned into a perfect symbol. She only wanted to be allowed to carry what had been given with dignity. Outside Windsor Castle, a small crowd gathered near the gates as the story grew. An elderly woman, holding a folded newspaper under her arm, said, "Perhaps the quiet ones remember best." That single sentence seemed to capture the national mood. People were not cheering a scandal. They were responding to something softer, something almost rare. Sophie knew then that the family could not dismiss this as noise. Louise had touched something beyond palace politics. The world's reaction left the family with one final task. They had to decide whether Louise would be allowed to own this inheritance without apology, or whether fear, rank, and resentment would steal its meaning. The final verdict would not come from the newspapers, but from the family's acceptance of what the pearls had revealed. In the end, the pearl crown set did not divide the monarchy as much as it exposed it. It revealed who valued rank, who valued memory, and who understood that legacy is not always handed to the loudest person in the room. Sophie's shock became pride. Louise's fear became dignity. And the family was forced to accept a truth that had been quietly waiting all along. Sophie reached peace slowly, not because the pressure disappeared, but because she finally understood what the decision had meant from the beginning. Louise's inheritance of the Queen Mother's private pearl crown set was not an accident, not a casual family gesture, and not a mistake hidden inside old paperwork. It was a deliberate act of trust. The Queen Mother's private pearl crown set meant a personal collection of pearl jewels connected to family memory rather than ordinary public ceremony. And that made the choice deeply emotional. Charles had approved it because he saw quiet service as strength. The king had chosen restraint over noise, character over ambition. And that mattered because the monarchy survives not only through crowns, but through the people trusted to carry meaning without using it for power. Louise accepted the inheritance with humility, and Sophie saw no triumph in her daughter's face. The young royal did not act as if she had won something. She acted as if she had been asked to protect something. That difference became the heart of the entire story. Sophie understood then that protecting Louise could no longer mean keeping her hidden from every meaningful responsibility. The trusted confidant had feared the storm, feared the judgment, feared the old resentments that might gather around her daughter. But she now saw that love could also mean standing back just enough to let Louise be trusted. Camilla's disappointment remained real, but the queen consort did not undo the decision. Her silence at the end carried its own meaning. The family did not reverse the inheritance, and that proved the matter had been settled. Edward later told Louise in a private family conversation, recorded in the household notes, that the pearls were not asking her to become someone else. They were asking her to remain exactly who she was. The father's words gave Louise the one thing the headlines could not give her: peace. The verdict was clear. Louise became the quiet guardian of royal memory. Sophie became the mother who learned that trust can be frightening and still be right. Charles proved that the monarchy could recognize emotional steadiness as a form of royal strength. Even Camilla's disappointment showed how powerful the decision had been, because only a meaningful inheritance could wound so deeply. There was no unfinished question left behind. The pearl crown set found its keeper, and the shock that stunned Sophie became the moment Louise stepped into history with quiet strength. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.